What's up, everybody? Joe Brown here. This is the Heresy Financial Show, and today we are talking about the next bailout. It seems like pretty much everybody is 100% certain that number one, monetary and fiscal policy right now, we're headed towards a crash, but also that inflation is going to stick around and continue to grow, but also that the next bailout come for everybody like it did in 2020. And I'm going to outline a little scenario here in this video that challenges each of those assumptions. That we are on the course for a crash, which will impact prices, which will mean an end to inflation. But the biggest thing here is that the next bailout could very easily not come for you and I. It could be a bailout engineered specifically targeted at the government, potentially financial institutions, and potentially large corporations, but not individuals. How the pain will be laid on individuals all across the nation, and they will just make sure the system doesn't collapse. And that anybody who is waiting around for that next stimulus check, that universal basic income, that plunge protection team to come in and prop up the stock market might be waiting for something that will never come. Ready? Let's dive in. All right, so everybody remembers what happened in the fallout of 2020 when everything started to crash. The Federal Reserve, in coordination with the federal government, stepped in and bailed out the entire system. Number one, we got the stock market to stop crashing. Number two, interest rates went down to zero. Number three, stimulus checks got sent out to people. Number four, corporate welfare. We had bankruptcies avoided all over the system. The government threw a ton of money into the system to make sure everybody had enough cash to make it through to the next day. We saw bonds being purchased by the Federal Reserve that they had never purchased before. Now, they did that through the Treasury. They didn't hold them on their balance sheet, but they bought corporate bonds. So all sorts of things happened all over the place. We saw suspension of mortgage payments, where if you had a mortgage, you just got to say, hey, I don't have to pay my mortgage for a while here. And so we saw all of these things happen that, number one, stopped people from experiencing bankruptcy, stopped people from experiencing defaults, stopped people from experiencing job losses. There was a bailout for literally everybody, individuals, financial institutions, corporations. And as a result, things went parabolic. As you might expect, when you print a bunch of money and shove it into the system from every single nook and cranny you can get it into, prices are going to explode. And now, as those prices have continued to move higher and higher and higher, we've seen the Federal Reserve shift their approach to this and say, hey, we've got to attack inflation now. And they've been very upfront about that for the last couple of months, saying, hey, at some point we're going to start fighting inflation. And then they have actually started doing that starting this month. They are selling assets off their balance sheet. Take a look with me at the balance sheet for the Federal Reserve, and you can see here this curve at the top that we have experienced. This will continue to head down, and so they're selling assets at $95 billion per month, which isn't as fast as they were adding assets to their balance sheet here. But when we take a look back at the longer time horizon, we've never seen them sell assets as quickly as they're saying they're going to sell assets right now. $95 billion per month. They've never done that. So they're saying, hey, we need to do this because it'll pull cash out of the system and that will help attack inflation. And they are also saying we're going to raise interest rates. So take a look at the federal funds rate. So we are seeing, over the last couple of decades, last 40 years here, interest rates have moved down. And every time they get a chance, they say, hey, we need to hike interest rates. Now, it never works very long, and they usually have to drop rates lower than they did before, but they're trying to raise rates here. And so we are seeing interest rates, the federal funds rate, move up, which will push other interest rates up as well. Now, a couple of things are odd about the mainstream approach to this. Number one, most people are now convinced inflation is persistent. Inflation is here to stay. We're going to continue to see prices go up and up and up, and everybody's still blaming the money printer. But if you take a look at this chart of M2, the money printer has stopped. The money supply today in May of 2022 is about the same as it was in December of 2021. The total money supply has been moving sideways. Now, we know it takes monetary policy a long time to work its way throughout the economy, usually somewhere around a year. This means that the money printer shut off 6 months ago. We've got max 6 months left of inflation. I'm probably one of the only people out there, especially with contrarian view compared to mainstream economics, that is saying, hey, we're in for a deflationary bust here if we continue on this path. A lot of people have now come around to the idea that inflation is here to stay, even Janet Yellen. Janet Yellen recently was talking and she said that inflation is likely to stay high, which by itself is probably a big enough signal to make you question whether inflation is likely to stay high here or not. So that's the first thing, is that the money printer has shut off. We've started to see quantitative tightening. We've started to see interest rates go up. And so we've got these deflationary forces. That means that we are likely to experience a crash coming soon. We're starting to see many indicators of a crash. Layoffs are starting to happen. Asset prices have started to fall. Many asset prices, especially many equities, many tech stocks, have already crashed 75, 80, 85, 90% from their highs just a couple years ago. And so we are experiencing all of these forces that are saying, hey, a crash is coming soon. But most people think the bailout is ready and waiting. Most people think the Federal Reserve will drop interest rates. Most people think UBI or stimulus checks are right around the corner, waiting for this next crash to happen, waiting for the bailout. And I think that is probably not going to happen for this reason. You don't actually need to. If we take a look here at this chart, this is the chart of the total federal debt. We're at $30 trillion and it is just going parabolic. They're borrowing a lot of money, the federal government is. This is the main problem. Everybody says, hey, interest rates get too high, the federal government defaults, right? Because they can't pay their debt from taxes. That's why the federal debt continues to grow. They have to borrow new loans to pay off the old loans because the money they're bringing in from taxes isn't enough to pay off those old loans, especially considering all of their other expenses. So they've got a lot of money coming in, but they have to borrow even more to pay off the old debt and to pay their expenses. So what happens if interest rates continue to go up? Well, they're paying off old debt, which is a lower interest rate, and they're borrowing at a higher interest rate. That means at some point here, they get to the point where they can't afford to pay off their interest expenses anymore. They can't afford to roll over their debt because as they borrow more, they have to borrow an increasingly higher amount to pay off the increasingly higher debt service cost. So at some point, this would cause the federal government to default on its debt. And historically, that is what happens. But all you have to do to avoid this is resume QE. If we take a look at what they did in September of 2019, what they did at the end of 2012, what they did at the end of 2010, what they did in 2008, every time they resume QE, but this time would be a little different. They would only be buying government bonds. They would be buying treasuries. At the same time, they could still keep on raising interest rates because any debt that the federal government owes to the Federal Reserve is interest-free debt. After the Fed pays for its expenses, they sweep all of their profits back to the Treasury. That means today, this $30 trillion debt, we see this chart here, $30 trillion worth of debt that the federal government owes to a bunch of people, a bunch of savers, financial institutions, central banks around the world, and the Fed. If you took all that 30 trillion and the Federal Reserve bought it all and their balance sheet went from 9 trillion to 40 trillion, then you would have the entire federal government's debt load be interest-free because they'd have to pay interest on that debt, but it's going to the Federal Reserve, which is just then sending it right back to the government. And so to the extent that the Federal Reserve is able to buy up all of the existing government debt and any new government debt, the cost of that debt approaches zero for the government. So we are transitioning through a time here where we are moving into a period of time where there's really no such thing as government debt right now. We are going to enter into a time when it's full, it's not even debt monetization anymore. It's really just, hey, we're taking advantage of the money printer. That way the government spends whatever it wants and it looks like debt, but it's really not debt. It's just funded by the printer, 100%. That's never been true yet. It's been increasingly true, and we are about to experience a transition where that becomes fully the case, that the United States government funds everything from the printer, and it just looks like debt because it's called debt. But the key thing to remember about this is that they don't have to do this for anybody else but the government. They only have to make sure that the government doesn't default on their debt. They don't need to make sure you don't default on your debt. Now, you might make a case that they would do this for financial institutions, that they would do this for large corporations, and that's very possible. If we take a look at non-financial corporate business debt, we can see that just like household debt and government debt, corporate debt is at all-time highs here. So if things get painful enough, we might see mass layoffs start. We might see bankruptcies start to become a big risk. We might start see defaulting on corporate debt be a risk. So the Federal Reserve might look at that and say, hey, we need to resume purchasing corporate debt so that if there are any defaults, it doesn't hit the economy. It just hits our balance sheet, which they don't care about profits on their balance sheet anyway because they actually print the money. And so they don't care about that. They would potentially start to purchase corporate debt. And that would mean that any defaults are isolated from the economy. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but the problem with this is the companies, the corporations still have to go about their day-to-day business. They still have to make payments. And so the government can utilize the money printer to make their payments, but just because the money printer buys corporate debt doesn't give large corporations the ability to finance their day-to-day expenses. And that is true, and that's where I think you might see the Federal Reserve step in and start buying equities as well through like SPY, ETFs, held at the Treasury again, just like the corporate debt. And this would give corporations the ability to finance their expenses by issuing shares, knowing that there's a floor under the price of their stock because we've got a money printer buying those shares. Knowing that there's a floor under there, we can issue as much new stock, as many new shares as we want, and fund our expenses that way. Now, you can do all of this and still have interest rates go up at the same time. You can do all of this and still allow individuals to go bankrupt. You can do all of this and still allow unemployment, because we remember right now their main goal is to attack inflation. And officials at the Federal Reserve have said outright that in order to stop inflation, you need unemployment. They're blaming the wage price spiral right now, where wages are going up because unemployment is so low. There are so many job openings that corporations are having to pay more and more and more just to retain talent, that people have more and more spending power, which is causing the inflation. And so the express purpose of this is to bring employment down, cause unemployment, to stop that inflation. So we very well may be in for a time period up ahead where the Federal Reserve is okay with letting unemployment skyrocket, is okay with letting layoffs happen. They watch those job openings sink down to zero very quickly, go negative where we have unemployment and layoffs start to skyrocket again, because they think that will be the solution for the inflation. At the same time as they are letting individuals crash and burn, they'll bail out the government, they'll bail out the banks, and they'll bail out the large corporations and let all the small businesses go under. All the small entrepreneurs and small business owners and shops and little stores, not massive chains, they'll all experience a lot of pain and all go under. And the largest employers, the largest corporations will get their bailout. They'll get their stock and debt bought by the Federal Reserve, by the money printer. They'll be okay, and we'll have a dynamic here where the bailout happens for them and not for you. That is a very real possibility. Do I think it's going to happen? I don't know. Do I think that it's more likely than not? I don't know, but it is very possible. And given how high expectations are that the next bailout will come for everybody, I'm very skeptical that that view is going to be true. So it might be time to start preparing financially for some hard times ahead, because if we experience a deflationary death spiral and they do bring a bailout in, it's very possible that bailout comes for them and not for you. As always, really appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.